The sky that hunted people. The year was 1977, and in the heart of the Amazon, paradise was about to become a laboratory of terror. While the rest of the world looked at the stars with the curiosity of a cinema audience, the residents of the small island of Collars, in Para, looked at the sky with pure survival instinct. What began as distant, silent lights quickly transformed into something that science still cannot explain, objects that did not just observe, but attacked. Beams of light, as thin as a hair and as intense as the sun, pierced through roofs of straw and wood. They weren't seeking gold or territory, they were seeking what flows in our veins. The nickname, Chupa Chupa, was not born from an urban legend, but from the screams of those who felt their own blood being drained by an invisible technology. Men and women fell into trances, paralyzed by the heat, while circular marks were branded onto their bodies like seals of an unknown property. The panic was so absolute that the Brazilian Air Force had no choice but to intervene. What followed was the largest military mission of UFO investigation ever recorded, Operation Plate, Operação Prato. Led by Captain Wirange Holanda, a team of soldiers armed with cameras and radars plunged into the jungle to hunt the impossible. They returned with thousands of pages, photos, and films that defy the laws of physics. But the price of knowledge was high. Decades later, after deciding to break his silence and reveal the truth to the world, Captain Holanda was found dead under circumstances that many refused to accept as suicide. We are about to open the forbidden files of Collars. If you believe danger only comes from the earth, the next 60 minutes will change your perception of who truly rules the skies of the Amazon. The Siege of Collars. Imagine the deep silence of a night in the jungle, interrupted only by the crackling embers of a fire. In 1977, that silence was replaced by an electronic hum that made teeth vibrate. Collars, an island isolated by the Amazon River, became the epicenter of an activity that did not follow the rules of our civilization. The fear was not subjective, it was physical. The first report spoke of apparatuses that emerged from the bottom of the river or descended from the clouds with the agility of an insect. They were described as metallic discs, glowing spheres, or cylinders that moved against the wind. But the real terror began when the light touched the skin. Victims described a sensation of unbearable heat, followed by a weakness that left them unable to call for help. It was as if the light were a solid tentacle, capable of siphoning the vital energy of anyone in its path. Dr. Wellade Cisim Carvalho, the only physician on the island at the time, began receiving patients with identical symptoms: severe anemia, dizziness, and first-degree burns with a strange geometric pattern. These were not burns from fire or common electricity. It was something that seemed to have been done with surgical precision. Patients arrived pale, as if they had lost liters of blood in seconds, even though there were no pools of blood on the ground. The routine of the island was destroyed. Men armed with hunting shotguns tried to shoot at the lights, but the bullets seemed to be deflected by an invisible shield. Entire families abandoned their homes to sleep in large groups on the beaches, believing the light would not attack in front of everyone. They set off fireworks to try and scare away whatever was up there, but the objects merely hovered, observing the futility of human resistance. Collars was under siege by a cold intelligence, and the Brazilian government was about to send its best men for what would be the most disturbing encounter of their careers. The panic in Collars had reached a breaking point. This wasn't just a series of sightings, it was a societal collapse. Families were boarding up their windows with thick wooden planks, not to keep out thieves, but to block out the light. Fishermen, the lifeblood of the island's economy, refused to launch their boats after sunset, fearing that the Chupa Chupa would rise from the dark waters beneath them. It was in this atmosphere of primal fear that the Brazilian Air Force intervened, launching what would become the most significant UFO investigation in military history, Operation Plate. The arrival of the military was supposed to bring a sense of security, but instead, it added a layer of cold, bureaucratic dread. A team of highly trained officers, led by the disciplined and pragmatic Captain Wirange Holanda, landed on the island equipped with high-powered binoculars, 16mm film cameras, and sophisticated tracking devices. Holanda was a man of the state, a soldier who believed in cold facts, hard evidence, and the sovereignty of Brazilian airspace. He arrived with the conviction that he was looking for secret foreign drones or perhaps a peculiar atmospheric phenomenon. He did not believe in little green men, and he certainly didn't believe in ghosts that sucked blood. The military set up their command center at the local school and established observation posts along the beaches of Collars and the nearby Baie du Sole. The logistics were grueling. Soldiers spent entire nights in the humid, mosquito-infested brush, their eyes glued to the lenses of theodolites, waiting for a spark in the sky. But the transition from skepticism to absolute terror happened faster than anyone expected. Within the first 72 hours, the apparatuses began to play with them. Captain Hollanda's logs from those first nights describe a cat-and-mouse game. These were not distant lights, these were structured, metallic craft that seemed to be aware of the military's presence. One specific report mentions a massive, cigar-shaped object that hovered silently above the military's base camp. It didn't just appear, it materialized, shimmering like a desert mirage before solidifying into a dull, gray metal. The soldiers, trained to handle combat in high-stress situations, found themselves paralyzed by a frequency that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The most disturbing part of the military's arrival was the realization that their presence did nothing to deter the attacks. In fact, the chupa chupa seemed to become more bold. Hollanda watched through his lens as a beam of blue light descended from a silent craft, searching the ground like a predatory eye. He realized then that he wasn't just there to investigate, he was a witness to a demonstration of a technology that was centuries, perhaps millennia, beyond anything humanity possessed. The mission was no longer about national security, it was about understanding a force that viewed the Brazilian military with the same indifference a human might show to an ant. The air in Collars grew heavy with the smell of ozone. The military was now part of the phenomenon, and the records they were about to generate would be locked away in secret vaults for decades, hiding a truth that Captain Hollanda was not yet prepared to accept: they were not alone on that island. Operation Plate moved into its second week. The military team began to collect data that defied every known law of aerodynamics and physics of the 1970s. Captain Hollanda and his men were no longer just seeing lights, they were documenting structured craft that displayed what modern researchers call transmedium capabilities. The objects did not just fly, they manipulated the very fabric of the environment around them. One of the most recurring and baffling observations was the lack of any sound. These massive metallic structures, some estimated to be the size of a 5-story building, moved through the thick, humid Amazonian air at hypersonic speeds without creating a sonic boom, a feat that remains impossible for conventional human technology even today. The military logs described the object's movements as erratic and intelligent. They didn't move in straight lines like a plane or a bird. Instead, they performed instantaneous right-angle turns and sudden stops from thousands of miles per hour to a dead halt. Hollanda's team used theodolites, precision instruments for measuring angles, to track these movements, only to find that the object seemed to be mocking their attempts. In several recorded instances, as soon as a soldier locked a lens onto a craft, it would blink out of existence in one spot and reappear instantly in another, suggesting a form of teleportation or high-level cloaking technology. The apparatuses also displayed a terrifying mastery over light itself. The beams they emitted, the infamous chupa chupa rays, were not like a flashlight or a laser. Soldiers reported that the light behaved like a solid object. It could bend around corners, stop mid-air at a specific length, and even penetrate solid walls of wood and brick as if they were made of glass. When these beams touched the water of the bay, there was no steam, no splash, and no reflection. The water simply seemed to part or become transparent under the influence of the beam. But it wasn't just visual. The physical effects on the military equipment were undeniable. Radios would suddenly erupt with a rhythmic, pulsing static that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat, and high-quality film was often returned from the lab completely washed out or fogged, as if exposed to high levels of radiation. The soldiers themselves began to report physical symptoms after close encounters: intense headaches, a metallic taste in their mouths, and a strange, prickling sensation on their skin that lasted for days. Hollanda began to suspect that the light wasn't just a weapon or a searchlight. It was a tool for data collection or biological sampling. One soldier recounted a night where he saw a small, glowing sphere, no larger than a basketball, emerge from a larger mother ship and descend into the jungle canopy. It moved with the grace of a living creature, weaving between branches with impossible agility, as if it were scanning every leaf, every insect, and every human in its path. The realization was chilling. Collars wasn't just being attacked, it was being mapped, sampled, and studied by an intelligence that regarded the entire island as a petri dish. While Captain Hollanda and his men tracked the skies, the true horror of Operation Plate was being documented in a small, poorly equipped medical clinic on the island. Dr. Wellade Cecim Carvalho, the local health officer, found herself at the epicenter of a biological mystery that would haunt her professional career. Her patients weren't suffering from typical tropical diseases or industrial accidents, they were victims of a technological assault that left behind physical signatures no medical textbook could explain. The Chupa Chupa victims arrived at her door in a state of profound shock and physiological collapse. As she examined them, Dr. Carvalho noted a chilling consistency in their injuries. Most survivors presented with small, circular marks, usually 2 or 3 puncture points, grouped together on the chest, neck, or inner arms. These marks were surrounded by first-degree burns, but the skin wasn't charred by fire. Instead, it appeared cooked from the inside out, as if exposed to targeted microwave radiation. The clinical data became even more disturbing when Dr. Carvalho attempted to draw blood for analysis. In many cases, she found that the patients were suffering from an instantaneous and severe form of anemia. Their red blood cell counts plummeted minutes after the encounter. More baffling was her observation that the blood in the affected areas often appeared precoagulated or, conversely, so thin it would not clot at all. It was as if something had selectively harvested specific components of their blood through the skin without traditional surgery, she would later recount. The symptoms extended beyond the skin. Victims suffered from intense, thermal heat that lasted for hours, followed by a total loss of motor function. Many remained paralyzed for days, staring blankly at the ceiling, their voices reduced to a rasping whisper. Dr. Carvalho realized she was looking at a pattern of non-lethal, but highly invasive biological sampling. The light wasn't trying to kill the residents of Collars, it was using them as a resource. As her files grew, so did the pressure from the military. When the Air Force officers learned of her detailed medical logs, the atmosphere in the clinic changed. Officers began to supervise her consultations. They demanded she hand over her original notes and photos of the victims' lesions. Most disturbingly, she was ordered to tell the press and the villagers that the symptoms were merely the result of mass hallucination or a collective psychological breakdown. Dr. Carvalho faced a harrowing moral crossroad. She saw the physical burns, she measured the drop in blood pressure, and she felt the cold, clammy skin of the terrified survivors. She knew that a hallucination does not leave behind surgical puncture marks or cause clinical anemia. By choosing to speak out, she risked her reputation and her safety, becoming one of the first voices to suggest that the military wasn't there to stop the phenomenon, they were there to document a harvest they were powerless to prevent. The files of Operation Plate reveal that the observers weren't dealing with a single type of craft, but an entire fleet of varying designs, each seemingly built for a specific purpose. Through the lenses of their high-powered cameras, Hollanda's team began to categorize these intruders. The most famous, and perhaps the most bizarre, was nicknamed the Lollipop. It was described as a glowing sphere attached to a long, thin, rigid tail. It didn't fly like a plane, it moved like a cursor on a screen, blinking across the horizon with a flickering, staccato motion that defied the persistence of human vision. Then there were the cylinders, massive, dull gray metallic tubes that hovered vertically over the Amazon River. These were often seen acting as mother ships, with smaller, luminous orbs emerging from their base before darting into the treeline. Witnesses described these larger craft as having a surface that looked like brushed steel, but with no visible rivets, seams, or windows. They were monolithic, silent, and radiated a sense of ancient, cold intelligence. When they moved, they didn't displace the air, they seemed to slip through a different dimension, leaving behind a faint smell of ozone and a localized distortion in the atmosphere that looked like heat waves on a desert road. But the most terrifying feature of these craft wasn't their shape, it was their primary tool, the blue beam. This wasn't a simple searchlight. Witnesses and soldiers described a concentrated, coherent pillar of light that possessed a physical weight. It didn't scatter like a flashlight, it remained a perfect, solid cylinder of luminosity from the craft to the ground. This beam had the ability to pass through solid matter, tiles, wood, and brick, as if they didn't exist. One military report details a beam that locked onto a target and followed them through a house, tracking their movement with predatory precision through the walls. Captain Hollanda himself documented a beam that appeared to be sampling the environment. It would touch a tree, and the leaves would wither instantly. It would touch the river, and the water would begin to boil in a localized circle without heating the surrounding area. The blue beam was more than a weapon, it was a remote access limb, a way for the occupants of the craft to touch, burn, and harvest the Amazon without ever stepping out of their machines. As the soldiers mapped the anatomy of these craft, they realized they weren't looking at vehicles in the human sense. They were looking at autonomous, or semi-autonomous, probes that treated the laws of gravity as mere suggestions. Until this point, the men of Operation Plate felt protected by their rank, their weapons, and their mission. But as they moved deeper into the dense, suffocating primary forest of the Amazon, the dynamic shifted. The soldiers were no longer distant observers, they became the targets. Deep in the jungle, away from the relative safety of the village beaches, the encounters became intimate, aggressive, and deeply personal. Captain Hollanda recounted several nights where his teams, stationed in remote clearings, felt they were being watched by something just beyond the reach of their flashlights. It wasn't the sound of a jaguar or a known predator. It was a silence so heavy it felt artificial, a dead zone, where even the insects stopped their nocturnal chorus. Suddenly, the canopy would erupt in a flash of blinding white light. These weren't beams from above, they were orbs, no larger than a human head, weaving through the thick vines and mahogany trees with a speed that no drone of that era could achieve. In one harrowing report, a group of soldiers was pursued by a luminous probe for over 2 miles through the dark undergrowth. Every time they stopped to take a defensive position, the object would hover exactly 30 feet away, pulsating with a rhythmic red light that seemed to sync with the soldiers' own heartbeats. When they raised their rifles, the object would dart behind a tree with a movement so fluid it appeared organic. The soldiers reported a feeling of mental pressure, an overwhelming urge to drop their weapons and surrender to the light. This was a psychological warfare for which no military training could prepare them. The most terrifying encounter involved Captain Hollanda himself. During a night patrol on a small riverboat, he described a massive, disc-shaped craft that rose silently from the black waters of the river, dripping with silt and weeds. It hovered just feet above the boat, bathing the entire crew in a cold, blue luminescence. Hollanda, a man of iron will, attempted to signal the craft using a powerful flashlight. To his horror, the craft responded, mimicking his light patterns with a series of flashes that felt like a direct, telepathic communication. The message was clear: we see you, we know you are here, and you are only here because we allow it. These deep jungle encounters stripped away the military's sense of authority. They realized that their high-caliber rifles were as useless as sticks against a force that could paralyze a man with a flicker of light. The hunters had become the prey, documented in secret logs that spoke of soldiers weeping in their tents and officers begging for transfers. The Amazon wasn't just a backdrop for these events, it was an accomplice, providing the shadows where a superior intelligence played a terrifying game of cat and mouse with the elite of the Brazilian Air Force. Throughout the duration of Operation Plate, the military wasn't just observing, they were generating a massive archive of visual evidence. Under the strict orders of the First Comer, every soldier assigned to the mission carried cameras equipped with telephoto lenses and high-speed film. The result was a collection of over 500 photographs and, most significantly, more than 16 hours of 16mm motion picture film. This wasn't the blurry, shaky footage often associated with civilian sightings. These were military-grade recordings, stabilized on tripods, capturing objects that were clearly structured and under intelligent control. The descriptions of these secret films are chilling. According to Captain Hollanda and the few technicians who were allowed to process the material, the footage showed mother ships the size of oil tankers floating silently over the jungle. One specific reel, which has become legendary among researchers, allegedly shows a disc-shaped craft descending toward the water of the Baía do Sol. As it hovers inches above the surface, the water begins to swirl in a perfect, clockwise vortex, yet no wind is felt by the observers on the shore. The craft then glows with an intensity that washes out the camera's sensors before disappearing upward in a literal blink of an eye. Even more disturbing were the films that captured the light-sucking events in real time. The military reportedly filmed beams of light tracking citizens through the streets of Collars at night. In these films, the beams appear to have a physical, liquid-like quality. They don't just illuminate, they grip the air. Some frames showed the blue light hitting a victim, who would immediately stiffen and fall, as if struck by a high-voltage taser. The precision of the tracking, how the beam could follow a running person around corners, was a technological marvel that terrified the officers in the darkroom. But where is this evidence now? After the mission was officially shut down, every inch of film and every negative was confiscated and flown to the capital, Brasilia. For decades, the Brazilian government officially denied the existence of these recordings, claiming they were lost or destroyed due to poor storage. It wasn't until the mid-2000s, following intense pressure from the UFOs, Freedom of Information campaign, that a small fraction of the documents was released. However, the high-definition films, the smoking gun of Operation Plate, remain hidden in the deepest vaults of the Ministry of Defense. Those who have seen the uncut footage describe a transformation in Captain Holanda after he reviewed the reels. He became obsessed with the details, spending hours analyzing the frame-by-frame movements of the craft. He realized that the film didn't just capture objects, it captured an undeniable reality that the world wasn't ready to face. The secret film of Operation Plate is more than just evidence, it is a mirror reflecting a technology that makes our modern achievements look like primitive toys, and its continued suppression is perhaps the greatest mystery of the entire saga. In late December 1977, just as the military team was beginning to establish a predictable pattern of the object's behavior and while the sightings were still occurring with terrifying frequency, the order came from the highest echelons of the Brazilian government: terminate Operation Plate immediately. There was no gradual withdrawal, no debriefing for the terrified locals, and no transition plan. It was a tactical evacuation. In the span of 48 hours, the trucks were loaded, the observation posts were dismantled, and the elite intelligence officers who had become a fixture of the island's life vanished into the morning mist of the Amazon. The suddenness of the termination left a trail of unanswered questions that still haunt the survivors of Collars today. Why would a government stop an investigation while its citizens were still being attacked? Why would a military command withdraw its forces when they finally had the enemy in their sights? The official explanation was that no conclusive evidence of a threat to national security was found, and that the sightings were likely a mixture of mass hallucination, satellite debris, and misidentified atmospheric phenomena. But to anyone who had seen the classified logs, this explanation wasn't just a lie, it was an insult. There are several dark theories regarding this abrupt end. The first suggests that the Brazilian military didn't stop the investigation because they failed, but because they succeeded. Some researchers believe the mission was terminated because a contact event or a formal communication had taken place, and the implications were so massive that they had to be handled at a level far above a regional air command. There are unconfirmed reports of a secret meeting between Captain Holanda and high-ranking foreign officials, just days before the shutdown, leading many to believe that the United States government had stepped in to take control of the data, effectively buying the silence of the Brazilian Air Force. Another, perhaps more chilling theory, is that the objects themselves forced the withdrawal. Captain Holanda hinted in his later years that the objects had become increasingly aggressive toward the military's electronic equipment, specifically their radar and communication arrays. It was as if the visitors had tolerated the observation for a few months, but were now signaling that the window of observation was closed. The soldiers weren't leaving because they were finished, they were retreating because they had been outmatched and intimidated by a force that could disable their entire base with a single pulse of energy. The impact on Collars was devastating. The residents, who had finally felt a sense of protection with the military's arrival, were now left completely vulnerable. The chupa-chupa didn't stop the moment the soldiers left. For months afterward, the lights continued to hunt, but now there were no cameras to record it, no doctors to document the burns, and no government to acknowledge the screams. The termination of Operation Plate was the first brick in a wall of silence that would remain standing for 30 years, a wall designed to protect the status quo of human power while leaving the people of the Amazon to fend for themselves against the unknown. When the last military truck rattled across the dusty roads leaving Collars, a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the island. But this wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a collective trauma that had no name and no permission to be spoken. For the people of Collars, the departure of Operation Plate was a second abandonment. They were left in a twilight zone where their reality was denied by the very state that was supposed to protect them. For the next 2 decades, Collars became the island that the world forgot, a place where the wounds of 1977 were allowed to fester in the dark. The physical scars were the most immediate reminders. Many of the Chupa Chupa victims never fully recovered. Dr. Waleed Carvalho continued to see patients who suffered from chronic fatigue, permanent neurological tremors, and a strange, lingering sensitivity to light that lasted for years. Some victims developed mysterious skin conditions, areas where the pigment simply vanished, leaving behind white, translucent patches that felt cold to the touch even in the sweltering Amazonian heat. These people weren't just survivors of an event, they were biological evidence of an encounter that the official record claimed never happened. The psychological toll was even more profound. An entire generation of children grew up with a deep-seated fear of the night sky. In Collars, the stars weren't symbols of wonder, they were predatory eyes. The social fabric of the town shifted. Those who spoke too loudly about their experiences were often ostracized or labeled as touched by the light, a local euphemism for being mentally unstable. This self-censorship was encouraged by the authorities. The Brazilian government maintained a strict, no-comment policy, and any mention of Operation Plate in official circles was met with ridicule or immediate dismissal. But beneath the surface, the stories refused to die. They were whispered in the back of fishing boats and shared around kitchen tables late at night. The forbidden files weren't just in military vaults, they were encoded in the oral history of the island. People began to notice strange patterns, certain areas of the forest where animals refused to go, or spots in the bay where the water would occasionally boil without heat, just as the military had filmed years prior. The phenomenon hadn't necessarily disappeared, it had simply moved into a different phase, one of sporadic, quiet observation rather than overt aggression. During these decades of silence, Collars became a pilgrimage site for a few brave independent researchers and ufologists who sensed that the greatest story in human history was being buried in the Amazon mud. They found a town that was a living museum of fear. The residents lived in a state of permanent alert, their eyes instinctively darting to the horizon at sunset. They were waiting for an apology from their government, waiting for a scientific explanation that made sense, or perhaps, waiting for the lights to return and finish what they had started in the summer of '77. This chapter of the saga proves that while you can confiscate film and classify documents, you cannot erase the memory of a light that burns the soul. For 20 years, Captain Wirange Holanda lived as a ghost within the military system. He had seen things that shattered his understanding of the universe, yet he was bound by an oath of silence that felt increasingly like a prison. By 1997, the weight of the forbidden files became unbearable. In a move that shocked the Brazilian armed forces and sent ripples through the global intelligence community, Holanda reached out to independent researchers and agreed to a series of filmed, in-depth interviews. He was no longer the young, rigid officer of 1977, he was a man who looked like he had seen the end of the world and survived to tell the tale. In these interviews, Holanda dismantled the official government narrative piece by piece. He didn't speak in vague terms or lights in the sky. He spoke of solid, metallic crafts, some appearing to be over 100 meters in length. He described, with clinical precision, how these objects would interact with his team, reacting to their signals and even appearing to read their intentions. He confirmed the existence of the high-definition films and the thousands of photographs, describing them as the most significant evidence of extraterrestrial presence ever captured by a sovereign nation. The most chilling revelation from the 1997 interview was Holanda's admission of direct contact. He recounted an evening when a small, glowing craft descended just a few meters away from him. He described seeing beings through the translucent hull, entities that weren't the gray aliens of popular fiction, but something far more ethereal, moving with a grace that felt almost divine yet profoundly predatory. He spoke of the mental downloads he experienced, a flood of information and images that left him paralyzed with awe and terror. "They didn't come here to meet us," he whispered to the camera. They came here to collect. Hollanda also exposed the international dimension of the cover-up. He confirmed that the first Comer was in constant contact with American officials and that the most sensitive data was funneled out of Brazil almost immediately. He felt betrayed, not just by his superiors, but by a global system that chose to keep humanity in the dark rather than admit it had no defense against these visitors. His voice, steady but filled with a haunting melancholy, painted a picture of a world where we are merely livestock in a vast, cosmic experiment. The interview was a sensation. For the first time, the leader of a major military UFO operation had gone on the record to confirm the impossible. But as the footage began to circulate, the atmosphere around Hollanda grew dangerously cold. He knew the risks of breaking his oath. He told the interviewers that he felt a sense of peace now that the truth was out, but he also looked like a man who knew he was running out of time. The captain had finally spoken, but in the shadows of the military establishment, the gears were already turning to ensure his silence would soon become permanent. Just weeks after Captain Arriv Hollanda gave his explosive testimony, the unthinkable happened. On October 2, 1997, the man who had become the face of the greatest UFO disclosure in history was found dead in his home in Cabo Frio. The official report was swift and definitive: suicide by hanging. According to the authorities, the captain had used the belt of his own bathrobe. He was found by his daughter, and the case was closed with a speed that left the international research community in a state of shock and deep suspicion. But was it truly the act of a depressed man, or was it the final operation to silence the forbidden files forever? The circumstances surrounding Hollanda's death are riddled with inconsistencies that point toward a much darker narrative. Friends and fellow researchers who had spoken with him just days before his passing described him as energized, relieved, and planning for the future. He was preparing for a second round of interviews and was allegedly ready to reveal the names of the high-ranking officers who were still hiding the Operation Plate films. A man who is about to reveal the smoking gun of the millennium does not usually end his life hours before the reveal. Furthermore, Hollanda was a military man of the old guard, a man of immense mental fortitude who had survived the harshest environments of the Amazon. To those who knew his character, the idea of him taking his own life felt like a script written by someone else. Then there is the physical evidence, or the lack of it. No suicide note was ever found. No psychiatric history supported a sudden downward spiral. Most disturbingly, several researchers reported that Hollanda's home appeared to have been searched. Documents he had promised to show in the next interview were missing. The personal archive he had kept for 20 years, which supposedly contained copies of classified sketches and coordinates of the craft landings, had vanished. It was as if, in the wake of his death, a cleanup crew had moved in to erase the final traces of the captain's rebellion against the system. The timing of his death remains the most damning piece of circumstantial evidence. Hollanda died exactly when his story was gaining international traction. By killing the messenger, the powers that be successfully turned his testimony from military fact into the ramblings of a troubled man. The mainstream media, once fascinated by his revelations, suddenly shifted their focus to his mental state, effectively burying the content of Operation Plate under the weight of his tragic end. This is a classic tactic of character assassination that follows a physical one: if you cannot discredit the message, you destroy the man. The death of Captain Hollanda transformed him from a whistleblower into a martyr. It sent a clear and chilling message to anyone else in the Brazilian Air Force who might have been thinking about coming forward: the forbidden files are protected by a force that does not hesitate to terminate threats. Today, the question remains at the heart of the caller's mystery: did Arriv Hollanda lose his mind, or did he find a truth so dangerous that the only way to contain it was to ensure he never spoke again? We are reaching the final chapters of this investigation. The death of Captain Hollanda is the most debated point in Brazilian ufology. Look at the facts: no note, missing documents, and perfect timing. What do you believe? Was it a tragic end to a stressed man, or was he silenced by the shadow government? Comment silenced or tragic below. Let's see what the community thinks about this cover-up. One of the most persistent and unsettling rumors surrounding Operation Plate is that the Brazilian military was never working alone. As Captain Hollanda's team struggled to document the craft in the jungles of collars, a shadow presence began to emerge in the background, a presence that spoke English and possessed technology even more advanced than that of the Brazilian Air Force. This is the American connection, a web of secrecy suggesting that the United States government, and specifically NASA, was intimately involved in the recovery and analysis of the Amazonian data. Testimonies from residents and low-ranking soldiers who served during the operation mention the presence of foreigners in the restricted zones of the first Comer in Belém. These individuals did not wear Brazilian uniforms, they moved with an air of authority that suggested they were the ones actually directing the flow of information. According to declassified cables and later admissions by retired officers, American intelligence was alerted to the collars incidents within weeks of the first Chupa Chupa attacks. The Amazon had become a focal point of the Cold War, but the enemy wasn't the Soviets, it was an unidentified presence that both superpowers were desperate to understand. Why would NASA be interested in a small fishing village in Brazil? The answer lies in the transmedium nature of the craft. Reports sent to Washington described objects that could enter and exit the atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour and dive into the deep silt of the Amazon River without losing speed. For an agency tasked with the conquest of space, the physics displayed in collars represented the ultimate, holy grail. It is alleged that specialized tracking equipment, far superior to what the Brazilian military possessed, was covertly installed on the island, and that the data was beamed directly to the United States via early satellite links. The collaboration went deeper than mere observation. When Captain Hollanda broke his silence in 1997, he hinted that certain physical artifacts recovered during the mission, fragments of metal or biological samples from the attack sites, were expedited to American laboratories. There are even claims that a secret protocol existed. If a craft were to crash or land, the Brazilian military was to secure the perimeter and wait for a specialized, foreign technology team from the U.S. to handle the recovery. This suggests a global pact of silence, where the sovereignty of a nation like Brazil was secondary to the management of the UFO phenomenon by a secret international cabal. This connection explains why the forbidden files remain so difficult to access today. It's not just the Brazilian Air Force protecting its secrets, it's a global intelligence network ensuring that the truth of what happened in 1977 doesn't disrupt the established world order. The Amazon wasn't just a site of a UFO sighting, it was a battlefield for a secret technological race. By the time the operation ended, the Americans had what they wanted, and the people of collars were left as nothing more than a footnote in a classified report filed away in a vault in Maryland or Virginia. The American connection changes everything. It turns a local mystery into a global conspiracy. Do you believe the U.S. government has the original high-definition films of Operation Plate? Or is the Brazilian military still the gatekeeper of the truth? Type NASA if you think the footage is in the US, or Brazil if you think it's still in South America. The official records of Operation Plate may have ended in 1977, but for the inhabitants of the Amazon Delta, the phenomenon never truly went away. It merely evolved. Today, as we move through the 21st century, the Chupa Chupa has transitioned from a localized terror into a persistent, modern mystery. If you travel to collars today and speak to the younger generation, those who weren't even born during Hollanda's mission, you will find that the sky is still a source of profound unease. The light hasn't vanished, it has become a permanent, silent tenant of the Amazonian night. In the decades since the military withdrawal, independent researchers and local witnesses have continued to document UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, with startling regularity. The difference now is the technology. While Captain Hollanda struggled with heavy 16mm cameras and film that could be easily confiscated, today's witnesses have smartphones and global connectivity. Low-resolution videos from the early 2010s and high-definition clips from the 2020s show the same erratic, intelligent movements described in the 1970s. The lollipop craft and the cylinders are still being sighted, often emerging from the same stretches of river that were mapped by the Air Force 50 years ago. Modern satellite imagery has also added a new layer to the legacy. Independent analysts have pointed out anomalous thermal signatures and transient luminous events in the region surrounding collars that do not align with any known commercial or military flight paths. Some suggest that there is a permanent base or portal beneath the thick silt of the Marajo Bay. The Amazon, with its vast, unpopulated areas and deep, murky waters, remains the perfect hiding ground for an intelligence that wishes to operate just outside the peripheral vision of modern civilization. The legacy of the operation also lives on through the disclosure movement. The bravery of Captain Holanda and Dr. Waleed Carvalho paved the way for a new generation of activists who refused to accept military silence. In 2022, following the historic UAP hearings in the United States, the Brazilian Senate held its own unprecedented session to discuss these phenomena. For the first time in an official capacity, the forbidden files of collars were mentioned in a hall of power, not as a joke, but as a matter of urgent national inquiry. The stigma is finally breaking, but the gatekeepers are still holding the keys to the most sensitive data. The most haunting part of the modern legacy is the realization that we are no closer to understanding the why. Why collars? Why the blood? If the phenomenon still exists, are they still sampling us? Some theorists suggest that the events of 1977 were part of a long-term biological survey that is still ongoing, but with more sophisticated, less intrusive methods. We may no longer see the violent blue beams every night, but the sense of being watched, of being part of someone else's experiment, remains the defining characteristic of life in the Amazon Delta. The legacy of Operation Plate is a warning: we are not the masters of our own house, and the shadows in the trees have been here far longer than we have. After 60 minutes of traversing the humid jungles of collars, declassifying military secrets, and investigating the tragic end of a courageous captain, we are left at the edge of a terrifying precipice. What was Operation Plate? Was it a simple case of mass hysteria, a secret Cold War weapon test, or the most documented evidence of an extraterrestrial presence in human history? When we weigh the evidence, the physical burns, the clinical anemia, the high-definition military films, and the consistent testimonies of seasoned pilots, the hallucination theory crumbles into dust. We are forced to face a much more disturbing reality. The truth behind the forbidden file suggests that in 1977, a corner of our world was transformed into a harvest ground. The visitors didn't arrive to deliver a message of peace or to conquer our cities; they arrived with the cold, calculated intent of biological surveyors. To them, the people of collars were not sentient beings with rights or souls, they were specimens. Whether it was for DNA, energy, or a long-term hybridization program, the Amazon was used as a laboratory. The Brazilian military, for all its bravado and firepower, realized it was as helpless as an anthill before a bulldozer. This is the real reason for the cover-up, not to protect us from aliens, but to hide the fact that our governments are powerless to stop them. Captain Waleed Holanda knew this. His decision to break his silence wasn't an act of madness, it was an act of final, desperate honesty. He understood that as long as the truth was buried in the vaults of the first Comer or hidden in the archives of NASA, humanity would remain in a state of infantile ignorance. His death, whether by his own hand or by the hand of a shadow agency, serves as a dark exclamation point to the entire saga. It reminds us that some secrets are considered more valuable than a human life, and that the forbidden files are not just paper and film, they are the blueprints of our true place in the cosmic hierarchy. Today, the island of Collars stands as a monument to the unknown. The Chupa Chupa has entered the realm of folklore, but for those who carry the scars, it is a living nightmare. As we look to the stars today, with our own rovers on Mars and telescopes peering into the deep past of the universe, we must remember that the greatest discovery might not be out there in a distant galaxy. It might have happened 50 years ago, in the muddy waters and thick forests of the Amazon, where a military captain and a small town looked into the eyes of a superior intelligence and realized we were being watched. The forbidden files of Operation Plate remain largely classified, a ticking time bomb of information waiting for the right moment to explode. Until that day, we are left with the echoes of the screams, the flicker of the blue beams, and the haunting memory of a man who gave everything to tell us the truth. The sky over the Amazon is vast and beautiful, but if you ever find yourself on the beaches of Para as the sun begins to set, remember the lesson of 1977, keep your eyes on the horizon, but be careful of what looks back at you from the light. This investigation has come to an end, but the search for the truth is just beginning. Every like and share on this video helps break the wall of silence that has surrounded Operation Plate for decades. What is your final verdict? Are we ready for full disclosure, or is the truth too terrifying for society to handle? Write ready or not ready in the comments. And if you want to dive deeper into the world's most guarded secrets, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next file we open might be the one they don't want you to see.